My name is Lisa Galiva. I'm the Executive Director of Advancement here at St. Michael's, and it's my pleasure to be your MC here. I'm going to begin by offering a land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of St. Michael's College operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across the island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to meet on this land. I'm thrilled to welcome you to St. Mike's keynote lecture, an opportunity during alumni reunion to celebrate the transformational education that our community continues to enjoy here and the thought leaders we're so proud to count amongst our alumni. In between today's events, please make yourselves comfortable. The Welcome Center and the Dodig Family Coupe is your home away from home. Enjoy those new leather sofas. The reno is spectacular. Hang out with your friends. While you're there, note that we're collecting donations to the Friends of the Kelly Library book sale. We have a bin there if you have any books that you're interested in donating. And help us to choose the design for our fourth ornament in the series of Christmas ornaments. There's a few options. Please vote. We're excited to find out what you want to see. Without further ado, please welcome President David Sylvester to introduce our keynote speaker today.
Thank you, Lisa. Good morning, everyone. So far, so good. How are we doing? I had a good time at the barbecue and the pub night last night. The weather cooperated. It was really nice. I am very pleased to be here to introduce to you someone you may know as a historian, as a classmate, or the former projectionist back in the day when this was a film theater here at Madden Hall. Doug can talk to you about that. And like many of you here, you know him as a graduate of the class of 1970. BA, Toronto, St. Mike's, MA and PhD from Princeton University. He's a distinguished university professor at the University of Ottawa, and life member of Clare Hall, Cambridge. Now, usually when I do this, I want you to know why you should be listening to the speaker, because they're interesting people, a good man, all that. But I feel like you may not know some of the background of Doug, so buckle up. I'm going to tell you just a few things of his academic accomplishments since he won the gold medal here in 1970 for his studies. This is just a brief highlight. Honorary Professor of Philosophy at the University of Sydney. He's held visiting appointments at Sidney Sussex College and King's College, Cambridge, the Center for History and Economics at Cambridge, Queen Mary University of London, the Fondazione San Carlo de Modena, the Scuola Normale and Superiore de Pisa. I've been there. Started by Napoleon. It is one of those, currently it's one of the places that draws the most distinguished philosophers, political theorists from around the world. So it makes sense that you were there. It's a good place and the food's good as well. He has lectured across North America, Europe, and around the world on Marx and German idealism, including the visiting professor at Beijing Normal University, the Beta in China. Doug is a longtime holder of the University Research Chair in Political Thought at his home institution in Ottawa. In 2007, he won the Killam Research Fellowship awarded for the Canada Council of Arts. For those of you who aren't Canadian, that's a big deal. He works on Leibniz, Kant, Friedrich Hegel, you're going to hear about that today, Schiller, Bauer, aesthetics, republicanism, and the history of ancient and modern political thought. His work has been published in 9 languages and has achieved international recognition in the field of political theory, philosophy, and intellectual history. Doug's latest book, Freedom and Perfection, his latest book, he's published more since he retired than I've published in my whole career. I'm a medievalist, not a German philosopher, a political scientist, but his latest book, Freedom and Perfection, German Political Thought from Leibniz to Marx, is being published by Cambridge University Press in July. So he can't sign those today for you, but pick it up and I'm sure he'd be happy to hit you up next year. You can hit him up next year for a signature. And late breaking news, yes, you're the first to know. Among the first to know, Professor Moggach has just been elected to a lifetime appointment at Cambridge University, Honorary Fellow of St. Catherine's College at Cambridge. Congratulations, Doug. Like I said, we here at St. Mike's thinks it all started in his graduating year when he won that gold medal. His title of his talk today is Modernity and Freedom, Lessons from Hegel. And we'll center around the modern idea of freedom, citizenship, social interaction, and relations between state and economy. Pretty timely, I'd say, as we're living in a time of profound social and political transformation. Professor Moggach contends that Hegel, who wrote more than 200 years ago, still has relevance for us today in the modern world and in our enduring problems in society. In his talk, Doug will outline his lifelong engagement with Hegel and explains his major ideas on freedom, justice, and progress, showing how they are relevant in the contemporary world. So take your seatbelts off, sit back and enjoy your classmate, your fellow St. Mike's alum, Professor Doug Moggach.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here today. This has been a wonderful reunion so far, and I hope it continues in that vein and that you'll leave here interested, at least in the subject. So I should explain that the subtitle of this talk, Lessons from Hegel, may appear entirely innocuous, but actually it's highly polemical. Let me explain. So I'll begin with an anecdote. I was recently a visiting fellow at St. John's College, Cambridge, which was founded in 1511 through a bequest from Lady Margaret Beaufort, who was the mother of King Henry VII. And the executor of her will was John Fisher, Bishop Fisher, the same Bishop Fisher after whom Fisher Hall is named, and where I happily lived for 2 years, and my roommate is here today. In any case, I was at dinner one night, and there happened to be a visiting American who was sitting beside me, who had been invited by someone. And as one normally does, we exchanged pleasantries and discussed what we did. And he told me he was a mathematician. I told him I was a political philosopher and worked on Hegel. And he responded with a series of insults, which I wasn't expecting, frankly. He said, first of all, he said, Canada is an incredibly provincial place. And he continued, I can't imagine there's anybody in that country who's remotely interested in what you do. And he proceeded to say, in any case, philosophy is a totally useless discipline. And finally, he concluded, Hegel would have nothing to tell me about the modern world. So this talk is in part a response to my critic. And I want to thank President Sylvester and St. Mike's for the opportunity to talk to you and explain why Hegel, in fact, does have things to tell us about the modern world. But I'll just take a step back further and explain how I got to my current intellectual position and a little bit more about me as a background to what I do and why I think it's important. So I've always loved history from a very early age. And this love of history was entangled with a love for Shakespeare. When I was 11 years old, my parents took me to Stratford, Ontario to see a production of King John, which was utterly transformative. And I immediately ingested all of Shakespeare in the next couple of years. And then when I got to high school, a very good Catholic high school in Hamilton, Ontario, where I grew up, we had a very demanding, brilliant English teacher who introduced us to Shakespeare through the works of A.C. Bradley, particularly Shakespearean tragedy, if any of you know Bradley. In any case, Bradley was a Hegelian. And this, though Hegel meant nothing to me at the time, this was my first exposure to Hegelian thought, and I loved it. And I loved it especially in relation to Shakespeare and to the explanation of historical forms of personality and their contradictions, the conflicts that arise from them. So I became incredibly engaged in this whole enterprise through Bradley. And then when I got to U of T, I came to study political science and economics with the intention of being a diplomat. That was my original plan, because I was pretty good at languages and I loved foreign travel, or at least the idea of foreign travel, as I had never experienced the reality of it. But I thought a diplomat would allow me to live in interesting places and do fun things. But in third year, I took a class with C.B. McPherson, a continuation of the introduction to political thought that had begun the year before. And that's when I really discovered Hegel. So I was involved in student government and the arts at St. Mike's, including being a projectionist in this room. But the discovery of Macpherson and Macpherson's introduction to Hegel taught me that this is what I wanted to do. It changed my whole idea of my career path, and it gave me an insight into how one can approach the study of history as a meaningful process, not simply as random struggles for power, but actually a process whereby societies engage with deep issues of meaning and their place in the world and the meaning of personality in those different societies. And all of that connected with my early interests, and it made perfect sense that I pursue this path. So that's kind of how I got here. Macpherson taught us that Hegel was a progressive thinker. So the Cold War orthodoxy had been that Hegel was a proto-totalitarian because he influenced Marx, and Marx was a totalitarian, therefore Hegel is. But Macpherson disputed that reading and showed us that Hegel was fundamentally engaged with explanation and dealing with concrete issues in modern society and their meaning, and in the interest of emancipation, in the interest of promoting freedom, not of promoting repression. And that insight is what has guided my future work as I studied Hegel and Hegel's successors, the Hegelian school, 1848 revolutions, and then moving back, as I've done in time, through Kant and Leibniz and earlier German thought, and trying to see the patterns that emerge in this body of thinking. Okay, so that's the general introduction. I note that this is a particularly exciting time to be studying Hegel. So since the 1970s, previously unknown lecture materials by Hegel have been discovered on all sorts of subjects. So not just the books he published in his lifetime, but actually courses that he taught, which the students at the time transcribed and kept copies of. And these copies have come to light, and people have been able to study them and compare them with the publication, and thereby see Hegel's thought in evolution as it engages with different adversaries, changes emphasis, changes focus, sometimes changes structure. So it's a very dynamic field, which is including all these new materials. Perhaps the most exciting discovery of which was 4,000 pages of material a few years ago, previously totally unknown, that had been compiled by Hegel's teaching assistant over several years, and which will give us, as these materials are published, will give us really new insights into his thought. So I can't address that element. I'm going to focus on one particular book of Hegel, The Philosophy of Right, that was published in 1821, and try to show how some of the issues it raises have resonance still today. Okay. Louder? Okay. Yeah, all right. So what Hegel enables is a rational comprehension of history, not merely as chaotic or senseless, though he does not flinch from acknowledging the arbitrary, the tragic, the accidental, but despite setbacks and obstacles, as a general movement of emancipation. History represents the progressive emergence and realization of human capacities and their enactment in social forms. The history of rational freedom. It depicts the sequence of stages of comprehension of self and world in which increasingly richer and more adequate conceptions are developed, overcoming errors and one-sidedness of previous forms. History is a rational process in this sense. The progression is not linear or smooth, but unfolds in a sequence of self and world understandings through their inner dynamics, contradictions, and transitions. The conflicts that beset history are not only over power and are not merely destructive, but are contests over values and ways of living, and are driving forward processes of social, political, and theoretical change. To trace that process and to show its interconnectedness as well as its dislocations is the task of philosophy. So the period 1780 to 1830 is one of the most fruitful times in the history of European philosophy and political thought, rivaling the achievements of ancient Athens, of Plato and Aristotle. Hegel is a foremost proponent of what is called German idealism, the philosophical current originating in the critical works of Immanuel Kant, 1724 to 1804. This philosophy is an extended reflection on the idea of freedom and on the prospects for its realization in the modern world. But it is both German and idealist in special senses. It's called German idealism, but it's neither really German nor really in any conventional way idealist. There was, of course, no Germany. German-speaking states at that time were a welter of kingdoms, principalities, dukedoms, and city-states under the titular leadership of the Holy Roman Empire, founded by Charlemagne in 800 AD, until Napoleon abolished it in 1806, leaving various political institutions and nationalist movements to struggle for hegemony in its wake. Scattered throughout this territory from the extreme northeast to the southwest were intellectual centers such as Kant's own Königsberg on the border of Russia, geographically remote but a commercial hub in close communication with Britain, Jena, where Schiller and Fichte both lectured, and where Napoleon was to win a decisive battle, Goethe's Weimar, and the Tübingen of Hegel, Hölderlin, and Schelling, the university where they studied, and where you can still visit, and they know which room Hegel lived in, and have other interesting things to tell you about Hegel's stay at that university. Later, with its newly founded university, Berlin was to play a leading role. In these centers, the effects of European Enlightenment and the French Revolution, adaptations of new Scottish and English political economy, and critiques of older indigenous theoretical traditions were distilled into a philosophical revolution. The essence of this revolution was an engagement with modern society and an account of its emergence and potentialities, undertaken among others in the works of Schiller, Fichte, and Hegel, with Kant in the vanguard. It is this resolute yet critical modernism which imbues German idealism with its particular characteristics. For all its inner divergences, it is a practical idealist approach, a brilliant vindication of freedom. If this philosophy is not really German, neither is it conventionally idealist. In its vindication of freedom, German idealism from Kant to Hegel differs from older types of idealist thinking. Plato's idealism, for example, had held that there was a metaphysical order of formal perfection or ideas, divorced from the material world, which offers merely an inexact replica. The new idealism after Kant enjoins instead the constant transformation of the objective world to secure a closer correspondence with the demands of reason. It is thus closer to Aristotle's sense of energeia, envergeia, being at work of an idea. The shaping presence of idea in matter, or the constant striving for an end, developmental sense. If for Plato change simply signals the metaphysical inadequacy and imperfection of the thing that changes. If something changes, it's because it's imperfect. And it doesn't get more perfect by changing, it just fluctuates. That's Plato. In Aristotle, change can represent a movement toward an end or a fuller embodiment. And this is the sense that Hegel adopts. But Hegel is more insistent than Aristotle on the activity of subjects or human agents as the sources of form, and thus the connection with freedom. In Hegel, unlike Aristotle, the purposes we pursue in our activities are not naturally given, but self-determined, stressing the importance of the person and conscious personal affirmation as components of freedom. German idealism is also unlike other modern idealisms, which reduce being to thought, or which are skeptical about the existence of the external world. It's not that kind of skepticism that Bishop Berkeley, for example, represents. For Berkeley, we are not entitled to assert an objective foundation or correlate for such perception. We have perceptions, but we can't say for certain that there's something behind those perceptions. There's only really perception. And so being dissolves into thought. German idealism is not like that. It doesn't repudiate the external world, but asks how we can freely, consciously, and better relate to it. This practical idealism is fundamentally critical of objective historical and social conditions which hinder free self-determination. So what Hegel does with this general approach of the rational development of freedom is to understand history as a sequence of stages. And each stage represents a different form of self-understanding, a set of values, and understanding of freedom. He begins with the Greeks. He begins earlier, but we'll start with the Greeks. And the image that he develops of Greek society in light of Schiller and other contemporary theorists of the time was that the ideal Greek individual was what he calls the beautiful individual. Beautiful because the individual is a perfect exemplar of the values of their society. They enact their social roles ideally perfectly. They fit right into their social milieu. And that idea of beauty is the sense of harmony of the internal, the self, and the external, the political order. So that is the Greek understanding of freedom as Hegel develops it. So that the individual is a microcosm of the polis or the city-state. But as Hegel shows, this form, for all its attractiveness, its beauty, is inadequate as an expression of rational freedom. Both sides, both the subjective and the objective, need to develop. Subjective, because absent for the Greeks is the principle of conscience or of individual affirmation of these values. The values are simply absorbed and enacted, but they're not consciously thought, reflected, posited, as Hegel says following Fichte. And that is made one's own, made consciously one's own. They're just taken in passively. So the principle of conscience needs to develop. The immediate relation of person and community is challenged initially by Socrates, who invokes his daimon or inner spirit to direct his course and his ethical stance, even in opposition to existing values. So Socrates begins to introduce the principle that becomes the principle of conscience. But its expression in Socrates is incompatible with the institutions of the polis, and therefore Socrates is executed. Sorry. But it bears the seeds of the future, but is not yet generally available. The next step is the Stoics of the Hellenistic period, Alexander the Great and the Roman Empire and Republican Empire, represent a further step toward conscious radical freedom within the ancient form. They stress the personal will or the conscious enactment of values, not simply the passive reception, but deliberate choice. But they do so in abjuration of the world. So the Stoics have the idea of personal affirmation, but they don't have an active engagement with the world. They retreat from the world into the self. The self becomes kind of a place of refuge from the intractable realities of the world. So they have the principle of the will, but it's not a will that is changing the world. And that's what needs to come. And that's what happens next. So if that's the subjective side that needs to develop the idea of conscience and reflection and rational choice, the objective side needs to develop as well, because the standards of the Greek beautiful individual are the polis, the local community. They're not yet universal. There's not yet a conception of universal human nature. And that will come with Christianity. That's the next stage. Christianity recognizes that all are free and introduces, following the Stoics, the idea of a common human essence and not merely local communities. And this common essence embraces both sinful human nature and the possibility of redemption. The next step in this process from the beautiful individual is what Hegel calls the unhappy consciousness. And this is his perhaps ungenerous characterization of medieval Christianity as positing two orders, the order of, in a kind of Platonic way, the order of our true essence, which is in the beyond, which is a redemption after life on this earth, and our sinful existence in this earth. And the tension in medieval Christianity is between those two extremes, the striving for the beyond, but the incapacity to realize the absolute, the good in the world. And the unhappiness of the consciousness is the striving for the realization of the incompatibility of these two levels or orders. Luther then comes along and challenges the medieval worldview and stresses the principle of individual conscience in a way that is reminiscent of Socrates, but is now infused with with the Christian universality. But Luther, if he challenges ecclesiastical hierarchy, leaves terrestrial hierarchies, feudal structures intact, doesn't challenge them, and even reinforces them by the religious support for existing political institutions. So that, in turn, then is challenged by the French Revolution that calls those earthly hierarchies into account and challenges them and replaces them with an idea of universal human rights, however inadequately through the Jacobins. But the principle of the French Revolution is the universality of freedom and the need to realize that freedom in concrete institutions. So that's where we are in Hegel's account. So where we are in Hegel's account as a result of this process is a new form of individuality, of freedom, which he calls the free and infinite personality. That's the modern form. And it's characterized by a twofold movement. On the one hand, the outflowing of private interest, of subjective interest. So the division of labor increases, the possibility of satisfaction increases, the capacity of individuals to adjudicate their political and social structures increases. So all of these are expressions of subjectivity taking on a fuller embodiment in the modern world. But Hegel says this subjectivity is also counterbalanced by a growing objective force, which is that these subjectivities can be reintegrated in new kinds of communities, not like the restrictive communities of the past, the Greek city-state, which is limited by natural considerations, by geographic and small size and so on, nor by medieval hierarchies, but in recognition of our common human interests and human values. And he thinks the modern state, properly understood, does that. And he goes on to elaborate this idea of modern freedom through what can be called a Trinitarian conception of personality. The free and infinite personality is made up of three dimensions. First is what he calls universality. And this is the ability to abstract from one's circumstances, one's desires even, in order to assess them. It's the ability not to be determined by anything outside of ourselves. The universality is the capacity to judge, the capacity to adjudicate, the capacity to determine what is correct and what ought to be. And that's the first dimension, the non-determination. The second he calls particularity. And those are the things that are simply given. There are tastes, our desires, our interests, our social relations, but is simply given. Things that we have to deal with and things that we need to evaluate through our universal capacity to evaluate. But these things do not simply determine us. So we're not simply determined by our desires or our tastes or our interests. They're there, but we have the capacity to abstract from them and to admit them according to rational criteria, which are admissible, which are not, and to act on the basis not of our desires, but of our judgment, right? So that's the relation of those two. And that process of selecting among the particulars and validating certain ones as worth pursuing, as goods to pursue, as our correct ends, is the third dimension of the will, this Trinitarian conception of the will. And Hegel calls that singularity. So singularity is the moment, the point at which we select among the range of particulars that we're given, simply given, and we invest our will in those things. We say, this is what I want, this is what I desire, and I'm prepared to defend that decision on the basis of its rational validity, the universality. So that's what Hegel thinks modern freedom consists in, that ability to be confronted by a whole growing range of new interests and new possibilities, but also to have the capacity to select among them which is the best, which is the one that is rationally defensible in the face of others, and to determine ourselves through that and not through simply a reaction to external pressures of different kinds. Now, this is interesting because it allows us to highlight certain oppositions between this German idealist idea of freedom and other contemporary understandings. Let me bring up the case of Thomas Hobbes, who's a English philosopher of English Civil War time, the 1640s. Hobbes develops an entirely mechanistic and materialist view of the human being as fully inserted into the natural order, right? So for Hobbes, Hobbes defines freedom as the absence of obstacles between the self and the object of desire. So in other words, for Hobbes, freedom is getting what you want, right? It's whatever you want. As long as you can get it, you're free. And that's because our tastes and our desires are determined for Hobbes by mechanical pushes and pulls. We're simply part of the mechanism of nature, right? And the things that we want, we can't explain why we want them. We simply want them because they attract us. So the mere, in Hegel's term, mere particularity, without this abstractive universality, the ability to judge. So we're free for Hobbes if we get the things that we want. There is a kind of rationality in Hobbes, but it is instrumental rationality mainly. Namely, what's the most efficient way to get what I want, right? That's where reason comes into play. Not in determining what is the correct end, but simply about the means to get that end. He also admits a kind of prudence, right? So even if I really want something, I might realize that pursuing it is too dangerous. And so I decide to restrain myself. But it's again, entirely instrumental. And interestingly, harking back to Aristotle, Aristotle has a type of person that acts like this, like Hobbesian man, who has instrumental reason, but not reason about ends or reason about purposes, finalities. And Aristotle calls that person, problematically, of course, but calls that person a natural slave. So the natural slave in Aristotle is capable of instrumental reason. That is, he gets an order from the master, he's able to carry it out efficiently. Otherwise, he's not a good slave. But he's incapable of setting his own rational purposes. That's what the master does. So that's how Aristotle justifies slavery, interestingly. But it seems that something like Aristotle's model of the natural slave becomes Hobbes's model of human beings in general. They have only instrumental reason. And so their relations are entirely governed by self-interest, in other words, by immediate self-interest. So that's, Hegel differentiates himself from that modern understanding. There's another modern understanding of freedom, which again is different from this. And that is developed by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau in the Discourses on Inequality, one of his Enlightenment works about the reasons why societies are hierarchical and not free. So Rousseau says freedom is not getting what you want, it's getting what you authentically want, what you really want. And this is part of Rousseau's critique of artificial social orders and false needs and our natural compassion with each other turned by social inequality into competitive relations where we seek to maximize things so as to flaunt our superiority. And that kind of freedom for Rousseau is not freedom either. And so freedom is knowing what you truly want, what you authentically want, and pursuing that. But that isn't good enough for Hegel either, because what you authentically want still has to be validated by rational criteria. It's not simply because I truly want this, not simply as a result of social pressure or prestige or whatever, but I truly want, it's still not good enough. Doesn't meet the standard of rational freedom, which demands that only those desires are admissible which are morally good, essentially, which can be shown to be conducive to a good outcome and good ends and good relationships. So that's a brief survey of Hegel's theoretical understanding of freedom. And I want to go on to some applications through ideas of justice and progress as well. So justice has to do, in the German idealist tradition, with the proper kinds of social institutions in which freedom can be practiced. That's the condition of valid institutions. They have to further the pursuit of rational freedom. And Hegel, in his account of the modern state, does try to outline institutions that are conducive to this kind of public good, as it were, and private freedom as well. But in the process, he underlines one particular problem that he thinks is highly definitive of modern life as well, and which requires resolution, which remains unsolved. And that's the proper relation between the state and civil society. So Hegel takes civil society to be largely the market, the emergent market where we exchange goods and we seek our own private satisfactions. And that for Hegel is important. It's an important part of freedom. He doesn't want to suppress the market because he sees it as the conditions for rational freedom being carried out. But he thinks that the organization of the market is also beset by contradictions. There are crises of reading the current political economists like David Ricardo, as he did closely. Hegel describes conditions of overproduction, of unemployment, of poverty, new kinds of poverty, which are not based on natural deficiency, like in the agricultural model where just wasn't enough food, but shortages due to maldistribution of resources. And he thinks this is also endemic in the workings of civil society. It produces these, as it produces conditions of freedom, it also produces conditions for unfreedom. And that needs to be resolved. And that is an open question in Hegel as to how that issue can be settled. And this is the point where I think his relevance to contemporary issues of globalization and tariffs and so on is quite clear, because he does provide a very clear analysis of how economic forces, important as they are, can also limit political freedom and rational freedom and need to be resolved. Now, it's from this point, too, that the left Hegelians, the so-called left Hegelians, the young Hegelians, the progressive Hegelians of the 1830s and 40s that I began my studies on when I left St. Mike's, this is the point where they take off from Hegel. And they look at questions of the resolution of these issues as the fundamental political task. There won't be a rational state until the problem of poverty and maldistribution of economic resources is solved. And that remains a critical part of Hegelian thinking. Okay. So I'm jumping ahead. I'm going to jump ahead to ideas of progress and international relations. So Hegel is also committed, like German idealists in general, to ideas of progress. But this is not a naive optimism. It's rather a serious engagement, a commitment to progress and extension of freedom and emancipatory institutions. This is a rational task that needs to be undertaken. But in his analysis of how this works at the international level, in Hegel himself, we encounter a possible obstacle. This is Hegel's attitude toward war, which requires correction or reinterpretation. His remarks on the philosophy of right have been taken to mean that he is offering an apology or justification for modern war because it demands that its agents put the collective interest ahead of their own survival. But these remarks need to be contextualized. Hegel's reference to war as potentially ennobling for its practitioners refers to levée en masse, to the armed and mobilized citizenry introduced by the French Revolution in defense of the revolution. And is undergirded further by a Platonic idea of the guardians, that special category that Plato had introduced of people who are not philosopher kings, but they're not mere artisans either. They're those guardians of the public interest who are prepared to sacrifice their lives to defend the polis. So that echo still resonates a bit in Hegel. But now it's all the citizens collectively armed and defending their institutions and as progressive. Hegel's thinking is also marked here in his remarks on war by concerns about breaking the primacy of private interest. In attesting to the priority of the common interest over individual happiness, military service is another way of checking the dissolution of communal attachments that Hegel thinks is operative in the market. The market tends to undermine collective attachments, and military service might be one of the ways in which the market can be checked. Its dissolving effects can be checked. So that's how I would interpret Hegel's remarks on war, not as simply glorifying war or imperialism, but as developing a certain view of the relation of state and civil. It's consistent with his view of the relation of state and civil society, which I outlined briefly. Hegel's referring to revolutionary and Napoleonic armies, not to the indiscriminate massacre of civilians, refugees, and children that we are now witnessing daily. Here, theoretically, a corrective to Hegel is in order, not only in his view of warfare that we can now see not as the ennobling force that he thought it might be in some cases, but more fundamentally, we have to perhaps rethink the relation of state and civil society in Hegel's own thought. So the problem I'm suggesting here is that Hegel thinks that civil society is essentially just the market. But we need to broaden that idea to understand civil society as also the site of contestatory movements, of social movements, of movements that challenge the power of the state or the institutions that the state is fostering, and perhaps have a more advanced view of what the state has to do than the state itself. So civil society is not just the market with its institutionalized predominance of private interest and economic gain, C.B. Macpherson's possessive individualism that he had introduced me to back in 1968. It is also the sphere of cooperative movements, of solidarities across communities, and of contestation of power and its abuses. Beyond the market, civil society is also a vehicle for emergent new moral values and the criticism of power misused, even when, as Kant presciently, notice I'll mention Kant in a minute, religion is used as a shield to preempt criticism and to mask morally repugnant deeds. Kant had described enlightenment as the process of challenging authority, basically. And he noted that religion and states will try to exempt themselves from criticism on the grounds of their sanctity or their morality, their grandeur. But in fact, these claims to exempt oneself from criticism merely expose the practitioners to more criticism. And that was Kant's remark in the Critique of Pure Reason that I think still resonates through Hegelian thought and certainly resonates today. To clarify the point, let me recur to my introductory remarks about the background of my studies, an aspect that I deliberately left out of account at the beginning of my talk. It was the opposition to the Vietnam War that was pervasive in my St. Mike's years and that formed my own political values and commitments. This was a movement of civil society, a mass protest against war and oppression that appears to be resurgent today and ought to be more resurgent, in favor of peace and against new adversaries, a movement that upholds new standards of international criminal law and morality, which have not yet found operable institutional force. Here, in its revulsion against political brutality, civil society is in advance of states, many of which have displayed complacency or complicity in the face of egregious violations of human rights. Here too, I would invoke the late Pope's condemnation of the slaughter of the innocents and the new Pope's intercessions for world peace. But with its commitments to the advancement of reason, a Hegelian perspective allows us to call power to account, to demand that the state be the representative of the general interest that it claims to be. As Kant also affirmed, we live not in a fully enlightened age, but in an age of enlightening. The Enlightenment heritage of critical reason enjoins on us an ethical exertion. That's the meaning of progress, an ethical exertion, to make the objective world correspond to the standards of rationality and humanity, which themselves evolve and are enriched by historical experience. This is what Hegel means when he says that with the Enlightenment, everything exists for the subject, for the person, for freedom. In this struggle, we emancipate ourselves and we become more like what we ought to be. And that is precisely the Hegelian legacy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Douglas. We now have a few minutes for questions. Lisa Webb and I are going to help facilitate those questions. We'd like to, if you could indicate that you have a question, we'll come to you with a microphone. We are recording today's lecture, so the microphone will help ensure that your question is heard by everybody.
Just a brief comment, actually. Thank you for your lecture. Very interesting. You made remarks about, you didn't say the nobility of war,
No,
but
ennobling.
ennobling
Yeah.
the process. Did I turn it off? No. So, and you began your lecture by mentioning Shakespeare in passing.
Yeah.
So it reminds me of the first time I saw Coriolanus, and I was so taken aback by the mother's views when she's pushing Coriolanus to be a noble warrior and to embrace war and embrace conflict.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
so different from what we think now.
That's a very, very good analogy. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But we can also think about Falstaff's remarks on honor, on the vacuity of honor, which is a kind of repost to that ennobling idea. You know, in Henry IV, Part 2, Falstaff basically dismisses. So, the more, okay, so if we read King John, which is my first Shakespeare play, the bastard there has a really interesting discussion about honor and its meaning and so on. And the echo of that is in Henry IV, when Falstaff on the battlefield is trying to save his life and he's feigning death, right, so that he's not killed in the battle. But he reflects on how meaningless honor is. You know, when he wants his next dinner and more sack, and that's important. And honor is just a word, and nobody will remember him when he's dead, but he'll have had a few good meals in the meantime. So, I mean, Shakespeare does deal with these issues quite brilliantly, as he deals with everything quite brilliantly. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen.
Hi, I guess my question is more of a practical nature. I mean, I'm listening to what you're saying and I'm feeling moved, and how frustrating is it for you to know all this stuff and watch what's happening in the world? You know what I mean? Like, are there some practical things we can do to feel
Yeah.
like we're making a difference, or that will add up to make a difference, or, you know, like, anyway, that's,
Yeah.
I can't articulate it really well, but I know, like, you have all this thought up here, and there's all this horrible stuff happening on the ground, and, you know, what can
Yeah.
we
How
do
do
to,
you bridge the
yeah,
gap?
yeah.
Yeah. Well, as I was mentioning last night, one of the really striking there's a lot of striking passages in Immanuel Kant I could cite, but one really good one and relevant to our times is that he affirms that there's a duty to be optimistic. Like, even when the world is going to hell and it looks awful, because if you don't, you've given up, right? You let the world go to hell, and that's what you can't do. So even if your efforts seem fruitless, there's this kind of moral injunction to do what one can. And I think what one can in the present circumstance, it's pretty clear. It's pretty clear where the contradictions are, where the problems are, and what needs to be addressed. Solutions are not clear, but the problems are clear. And that's all another thing about Hegel, right? He doesn't give us solutions, but he shows what the problems are, where the issues arise, and then invites you to think about what can be done, right? And that's what we have to do. But there are sufficient movements that are pointing in positive directions that we can support and that I think we are obliged to support. And other things that are obviously evil and that we need to oppose. And so there's enough clarity amongst the chaos to at least find a bearing and find a path and remember that what we are under this moral injunction to do so. And that's maybe the most important lesson of all. But thank you for that. It's a really good question.
For your question, Edith.
Thank you for your presentation. I wanted to ask you some comments about republicanism. And, you know, we're confronted with our neighbors in terms of Democrats, Republicans, and there's a lot at that stage in terms of thoughts on republicanism drawn from Hegel.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that we could understand how to conceptualize republicanism in contemporary times?
First, it's not the Republican Party of the US.
Exactly.
No. So there is a current that actually has been widely associated with Cambridge University historians like Quentin Skinner, Pocock, and others, Richard Burke, which looks at specifically Republican movements in Europe largely, but also in North America, and which attempts to differentiate liberalism from republicanism. So liberalism typically is the kind of view that I described as Hobbesian, right? So basically freedom is self-interest, is achieving your self-interest, achieving the goals that you set for yourself, whatever they might be. And institutions are largely an obstacle to that process. I mean, they might, insofar as they mitigate conflict over different private ends, they're good, but it's just a negative context in which institutions basically limit freedom, is the typically liberal view. So therefore you get libertarianism as so minimal state as an implication of liberty. It's not the only one. There can be interventionist liberalisms, but typically there's this suspicion of institutions. Republicanism, on the other hand, which goes back to the Greeks, is the idea that there is beyond private interest, there is a common interest, a collective interest, and that institutions need to be created, sustained, enhanced, which foster that collective interest. And this further involves participation by people in shaping and enacting those institutions. So it's more of a citizen-based rather than civil society economy-based idea, typically. Also, there's a distinction that's made frequently in the literature between freedom as non-interference and freedom as non-domination. So freedom as non-interference is the typically liberal view, and that holds I'm free if nobody bothers me in pursuing my objectives, or people keep out of my way. So I'm not being interfered with. But the non-domination view that's linked to republicanism holds that it's not just the fact of interference, but it's the possibility of interference, which is an obstacle to freedom. That is, if I exist in a situation where I could potentially be hampered in my action, but it depends on the goodwill of the person who has power over me, then I'm still not free because I'm still dependent on the arbitrary judgment of that superior or that institution, whether they will let me or not carry out my objectives. So that's linked to non-domination. And interestingly further, Karl Marx, in his early work on alienated labor, adopts a perspective like that in talking about what alienated labor is. So for Marx, the problem of labor under capitalism is not just that workers are poor. They are, but that's not the main problem. The main problem is that they're not self-determining in work, that their ends are imposed by the owners of the means of production. So work becomes imposed and not spontaneous, not self-affirmation. That's what alienation is. It's the loss of control over one's work, not only over the product of the work, but over the process itself. So for Marx, merely distributive socialism that makes things fairer or, levels income, raises income levels, that's not the solution. It's part of it, but it's not enough. What you have to add to it a Republican dimension, which Marx still had at that point, namely the idea of self-determination. And that is only achieved under different institutional arrangements than the current ones. So, I mean, Marx fits into this story too, though I think he deviates later. But in these early texts, there's a clear affinity with what we can call Republican themes of self-determination, of freedom from domination, and of collective interest.
Thanks so much. We have time for more question.
Douglas, thank you. I'm really inspired to go back to Plato and, to philosophy of right, which to me are impenetrable, because you see the point out, you seem to have given me anyway, a thread to follow it through. So I'm excited about that. But I'd like to ask you about Trinitarianism and modern economics, which is based on the concept, which it's frustrating but exciting to me, that in Aristotle and Hegel, as you explain, you already have a critique of the basis of modern economics, which is, the pursuit in the 1870s, the pursuit of utility, of satisfaction, of the individual choice, which is just unexamined, but you've examined it. So I just wonder if you want to comment on the Trinitarian critique of modern economics, because that needs to be blown away.
So Hegel has this idea of the will as having three dimensions, right? One is the universality, the abstractive, which is what Kant had called negative freedom in the Critique of Practical Reason. Negative freedom in Kant is the ability we possess as imperfectly rational creatures, namely composed of sensibility and reason, not just reason, but both. But our ability to be sensibly affected, but not sensibly determined. So my senses and the things in the world impinge on me. They shape my will, or they give me material for my will. But unlike Hobbes, they don't determine my will. They're just possibilities, right? And they become real, they become causes only when I admit them, only when I accept them, right? They don't just work blindly on me. So I can step back, I can assess them, and then I admit them. Now, there's no guarantee that I'll make the right choice, right? I can allow myself to be determined by desires that are inappropriate or wrong, right? But it's still me doing that. And the liberals think, or Hobbes anyway, thinks that I'm just determined, right? I just have this desire and I'm going to carry it out until it's too dangerous for me to do so. Then I'll stop. But the idealist response is, these are possibilities. They're there. We can do that. But if we opt to be determined by a desire in opposition to duty or what ought to be, we're still the actor. We're still the agent, as it were. It's not the external cause that's working on it. It's still me doing the bidding, but I'm doing the bidding of this external cause. I'm admitting it, right? So I collude with the external cause, and this was what Kant calls heteronomy, as opposed to autonomy, which is self-determination, rational self-determination. But heteronomy is not just that the external cause makes me do something. It's that I let the external cause make me do something. I allow it to. And that's the idealist twist on the story. And the result is when I do invest my will in something and I make it real in that sense, that's also ideal. So thought does determine being in this way. It doesn't make being disappear, but it does determine being. Because by thinking this cause to be effective and operative, I make it so. That's singularity. That's the third moment of this Trinitarian structure.
So much for your question. I think our mic goes in and out. Please join me in thanking Professor Moggach for this inspiring talk this morning. On behalf of all of us, I'd like to present you with a token of our appreciation.
Thank you so much. Lovely. Thank you. Lovely. Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you so much. Okay, thank you. How was the time?
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll just,
Oh, okay, sorry, there's another announcement.
sorry, I'll just mention, for those of you attending the tour, you'll be meeting just outside this building in the quad. And the tour is Footprints in Time, a historical journey. And we'll see you back here at 11:45 for the Alumni Initiative for Women Conversation Series. Have a good day.